Deep in the frozen streets of Billings, Montana, homeless mother Sarah thought the bitter cold was her greatest enemy. She was wrong. For 3 desperate weeks, she and her 2-year-old daughter Emma survived on scraps and prayers, their German Shepherd Bear their only warmth against merciless winter nights. Every shelter turned them away. When temperatures plunged to lethal levels, Bear began acting strangely. He wasn't afraid of the cold, but obsessed with something hidden behind an abandoned warehouse. With desperate urgency, he pulled them through deep snow toward a large white van concealed in shadows, its windows frosted over. A thin wisp of exhaust rose from beneath. The engine was running. Someone was inside. What Sarah discovered when she opened that door would either save their lives or reveal a danger more terrifying than freezing to death. Why was this van hidden on the coldest night of winter? What secret waited inside that only Bear could sense? Sarah Winters had once been the kind of woman who believed the system worked, that honesty mattered, that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. 3 months ago, she had sat in a clean, climate-controlled office on the 3rd floor of the Apex Environmental Services building in downtown Billings, Montana, her fingers flying across a keyboard as she analyzed pollution data for industrial clients across the state. She was good at her job, meticulous and thorough, the kind of employee who stayed late to double-check her work, who took pride in the precision of her reports. She was 34 years old, a single mother raising her 2-year-old daughter Emma alone after her ex-husband had walked out on them 4 years earlier, disappearing into a new life in Seattle with a new woman and a carefully constructed amnesia about the family he had left behind. It had been hard, juggling the demands of work and motherhood, but Sarah had managed. She had kept their small 2-bedroom apartment clean and warm, had packed Emma's lunches every morning, had attended every parent-teacher conference, and had even managed to adopt Bear, a gray and white German Shepherd from the shelter, a loyal companion who had become Emma's best friend and Sarah's protector. Life had not been easy, but it had been stable, predictable, safe. Then she had found the discrepancies. It started small, a single data point that didn't match between a client's self-reported emissions and the actual soil samples Apex had collected. She had assumed it was a clerical error, but when she dug deeper, she found more inconsistencies, a pattern of systematic falsification that stretched back years. Apex Environmental Services, the company she had trusted, the company that presented itself as a guardian of Montana's natural beauty, was deliberately altering pollution reports, allowing their corporate clients to dump toxic waste into the ground and water with impunity. She had done what she thought was right. She had compiled the evidence, documented every fraudulent report, every falsified test result, every manipulated data set, and she had taken it to her supervisor, Richard Cole, a man she had respected, a man she had believed would share her outrage. Instead, he had looked at her with cold, flat eyes and told her to delete everything she had found, to forget what she had seen, to remember that she had a daughter to feed. When she refused, when she threatened to take the evidence to the EPA, the walls had closed in with terrifying speed. She was fired the next day for gross insubordination and theft of company data. Within a week, her name had been quietly passed to every environmental firm in the state. She was blacklisted, unemployable, marked as a troublemaker who couldn't be trusted. Her landlord, who had always been friendly, suddenly found violations in her lease and served her with an eviction notice. Her bank account, already stretched thin by single motherhood, couldn't absorb the shock. 3 weeks ago, she had packed everything she and Emma could carry into 2 duffel bags, loaded Bear into her failing truck, and left the apartment that had been their home. The truck had died 2 days later, another casualty of a life unraveling. Now they moved through the frozen streets of Billings like ghosts, sleeping in shelters when there was room, huddling in abandoned buildings when there wasn't, surviving on the charity of soup kitchens and the dwindling few dollars Sarah had left. Emma, once a bright, laughing girl who loved science and books, had grown quiet and withdrawn, her eyes holding a weariness no child should know. Bear stayed close, a silent gray guardian whose warm bulk was often the only thing that kept them from freezing on the coldest nights. Sarah had believed in justice, in truth, in the idea that standing up for what was right would matter. Instead, she had lost everything, and the bitter Montana winter was closing in like a fist. The weather forecast had been warning about it for days, but warnings meant nothing when you had nowhere to go. The Arctic front descended on Billings with the merciless inevitability of a predator closing in on wounded prey, transforming the city into a frozen wasteland where the air itself became a weapon. By noon, the temperature had plummeted to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the meteorologists on the small television in the public library, where Sarah had taken Emma to stay warm for a few precious hours, spoke in grave tones about wind chills reaching -30, about frostbite occurring in minutes of exposure, about the very real danger of death for anyone caught outside without proper shelter. Sarah had spent the afternoon in a desperate circuit of every shelter, every church, every organization she knew, her desperation growing with each closed door. The rescue mission was full, packed beyond capacity with families just like hers. The YWCA had a waiting list 3 days long. Street. Vincent de Paul had space for women and children but refused to take Bear, and Sarah would not, could not, abandon the dog who had protected them through these terrible weeks. By 4 in the afternoon, with the pale winter sun already sinking toward the jagged line of the Beartooth Mountains and the temperature dropping to -15, she stood in the overheated lobby of the Salvation Army shelter on North 30th Street, the last option on her list, facing a young worker named Jessica, whose eyes were filled with genuine anguish. "I'm so sorry," Jessica said, her voice breaking slightly as she looked at Emma, who stood silent and shivering despite the building's warmth, her thin jacket inadequate against the cold that was coming. "We're at 140% capacity. We have people sleeping in the hallways, in the chapel, everywhere. The fire marshal has already threatened to shut us down. I wish I could help you." "I really do." Sarah had nodded, unable to speak past the lump of terror in her throat, and led Emma back out into the brutal cold. The wind hit them like a physical blow, a howling gale that carried tiny particles of ice that stung exposed skin like 1,000 needles. By the time full darkness fell at 5:30, the temperature had reached -20, and the streets of Billings were eerily empty, every sensible person barricaded inside against the lethal night. Sarah, Emma, and Bear made their way through the industrial district on the south side of town, past shuttered warehouses and silent loading docks, searching for any place that might offer even minimal protection from the wind. They found a narrow alley behind an abandoned brick warehouse, a space barely wide enough for the 3 of them, sheltered on 3 sides by old walls and a rusted dumpster. Sarah spread their 2 thin blankets on the frozen ground, layering them as best she could. Emma curled into a tight ball, her body shaking uncontrollably, her lips already taking on a bluish tint that made Sarah's heart clench with fear. Bear, understanding the danger in the way only animals can, pressed his large, warm body against Emma's back, his thick gray and white coat providing insulation that their pathetic blankets could not. Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter from the other side, creating a cocoon of shared body heat, but she could feel the cold seeping through every layer, invading her bones, stealing the warmth from her core. The wind screamed through the alley, and the night stretched ahead of them like an eternity. Emma's shivering grew weaker rather than stronger, a terrifying sign that her body was losing the fight against hypothermia. Sarah held her tighter, whispering promises she didn't know if she could keep, prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening, while Bear's steady breathing and the terrible howl of the Arctic wind were the only sounds in the frozen darkness that was trying to kill them. They had been huddled in the alley for perhaps 2 hours, though time had lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness and cold, when Bear's behavior changed in a way that cut through Sarah's growing fog of hypothermic exhaustion. The dog, who had been their faithful warm anchor against the lethal cold, suddenly lifted his head, his ears snapping forward to rigid attention, his entire body going tense, in a way Sarah recognized from the months they had spent together. He rose to his feet, his movement abrupt and urgent, pulling away from Emma despite the girl's weak whimper of protest at the loss of his warmth. Bear began to pace in the narrow confines of the alley, his paws crunching on the ice-crusted pavement, his breath coming in sharp white puffs that hung in the frozen air. A low, insistent whine started deep in his chest, not the sound of fear or pain, but something else entirely, something purposeful and demanding. Sarah's mind, dulled by cold and despair, struggled to process what she was seeing. Bear moved to the mouth of the alley, looked back at her with eyes that gleamed amber in the faint light from a distant street lamp, and whined again, louder this time, more insistent. He took a few steps into the darkness beyond their shelter, then returned, circling her, his cold nose nudging her arm, her shoulder, pushing at her with increasing urgency. He gripped the sleeve of her coat gently in his teeth and pulled, not aggressively but with clear intent, trying to move her, trying to lead her somewhere. "Bear, no." Sarah mumbled through numb lips, her words slurred. "Stay. We have to stay together." But the dog ignored her command, something he had never done before. He released her sleeve, moved to Emma, and began nudging the girl's face with his nose, licking her pale cheeks, whining with what sounded almost like desperation. Then he returned to Sarah, planted himself directly in front of her, and barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that echoed off the brick walls. It was that bark that cut through Sarah's dangerous lethargy, that pulled her back from the edge of giving up. She had spent enough time with Bear to understand his language, to read the subtle differences in his posture and sounds. This wasn't the alert stance he took when he sensed a threat, when a stranger approached too close, or when he heard something that put him on guard. This was different. His tail was up, his body vibrating with energy rather than tension, his whining interspersed with little excited huffs. This was the behavior he exhibited when he found something, when he discovered a discarded sandwich behind a restaurant, or located a warm steam grate where they could rest. Bear had found something, and he was trying desperately to tell her it was important, that she needed to move, needed to follow him, needed to trust him. Sarah looked at Emma, whose shivering had become weaker, more sporadic, the child's eyes glazed and unfocused. They were dying here, slowly freezing to death in this alley, and Bear knew it. Whatever the dog had found, it had to be better than waiting here for the cold to claim them. With movements that felt like they belonged to someone else's body, Sarah forced herself to stand, her joints screaming in protest, her muscles stiff and clumsy. She bent down and lifted Emma, the girl's small body alarmingly light and limp in her arms. "Okay, boy?" Sarah whispered, her voice a rasp in the frozen air. Show me what you found." Bear's response was immediate. His tail began to wag, and he turned and trotted purposefully into the darkness beyond the alley, looking back every few steps to make sure Sarah was following. She staggered after him, carrying Emma, her boots sliding on patches of ice, the wind tearing at her with renewed fury. She had no idea where Bear was leading them, no idea if she was making a terrible mistake by leaving even the minimal shelter of the alley. But she had learned over these brutal weeks that Bear's instincts were sharper than her own, that his senses detected things she could not see. She trusted him with their lives because she had no other choice, and because in this frozen hell, he had never once let them down. Bear led them away from the alley, moving with purpose through the industrial wasteland of abandoned buildings and silent loading bays, his gray and white form barely visible against the snow that had begun to fall in thick, heavy flakes that swirled in the brutal wind. Sarah followed, her boots breaking through the crust of older snow with each step, sinking into drifts that sometimes reached her knees, her arms burning with the effort of carrying Emma, whose trembling had become constant and violent, the child's breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps against Sarah's neck. They moved deeper into the maze of warehouses, past rusted chain-link fences and overflowing dumpsters, into a part of the district Sarah had never explored, where the streetlights were broken or absent, and the darkness was nearly absolute. Bear never hesitated, never paused to reconsider his route, moving with the confidence of a creature following a scent or a sound that was as clear to him as a map. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, Bear stopped at the edge of a large loading dock area behind a particularly decrepit warehouse whose windows were boarded over and whose walls were covered in faded graffiti. He looked back at Sarah, gave a soft woof of encouragement, and then trotted around the corner of a concrete loading platform. Sarah followed, her heart hammering now with something beyond just the physical strain, a new tension born of uncertainty about what they were walking into. What she saw made her freeze in her tracks. There, tucked into the deep shadows between the loading dock and a high brick wall, almost invisible in the darkness, was a large white cargo van. It was not abandoned. Sarah could see that immediately because thin wisps of exhaust vapor rose from beneath the vehicle's chassis, visible in the frigid air, delicate gray tendrils that could only mean one thing. The engine was running. Someone was inside. The van's windows were completely frosted over, thick layers of ice crystals obscuring any view of the interior, and no light escaped from within. But the steady hum of the engine was unmistakable now that she was close enough to hear it over the wind. Bear trotted up to the van's side door and sat, looking back at Sarah expectantly, his tail sweeping the snow behind him. Sarah stood motionless, Emma's weight growing heavier in her arms, her mind torn between desperate hope and primal fear. A running vehicle meant warmth, meant potential salvation from the lethal cold that was killing her daughter, but it also meant an unknown person, a stranger who might be dangerous, who might be a predator, who might be the very last person two homeless females should approach in the dark. Her instinct for self-preservation, honed by weeks on the streets where every interaction carried risk, screamed at her to turn around, to find another way, to not put Emma in a different kind of danger. But Emma's shaking was weakening, her small body growing alarmingly still in Sarah's arms, and Sarah knew with terrible certainty that they had perhaps an hour, maybe less, before hypothermia claimed her daughter. She looked at Bear, who remained sitting by the van door, calm and patient, showing none of the tension he displayed when he sensed a threat. The dog had saved them more than once with his instincts, his ability to sense danger before Sarah's merely human senses registered it. If Bear thought this was safe, if Bear had led them here deliberately, then she had to trust him. Sarah stepped forward, her legs shaking from more than just cold, and shifted Emma's weight so she could raise one numb fist. She hesitated for just one more heartbeat, a final moment of doubt, then knocked firmly on the van's cold metal door, the sound echoing hollowly in the frozen night, sealing their fate one way or another. Sarah knocked again, louder this time, and waited, her breath coming in ragged clouds, Emma's weight pressing down on her exhausted arms, Bear standing alert at her side. There was no response, no sound of movement from within, no voice calling out to ask who was there or what they wanted. The van's engine continued its steady hum, the exhaust rising in those thin, ghostly wisps, but nothing else stirred. Sarah's fear began to shift, morphing from terror of who might be inside to a growing suspicion that perhaps no one was inside at all. She reached out with one trembling hand and tested the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it yielded immediately under her touch, the latch clicking open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence. She pulled the door open, bracing herself for anything, for someone to lunge at her from the darkness, for a shout of anger or alarm. But what greeted her was not a person but a wall of blessed warmth that rolled out of the van's interior like a physical thing, washing over her frozen face and hands with an intensity that was almost painful. The inside of the van was dimly lit by the soft glow of several LED strips running along the ceiling, providing just enough illumination to see that the space was completely empty of human occupants. What it was not empty of was equipment. Sarah stood in the open doorway, staring in disbelief at what she was seeing. This was not a living space, not a camper van converted for someone to sleep in, but something else entirely. It was a mobile laboratory, a sophisticated workspace crammed into the cargo area of an ordinary commercial vehicle. Along one wall ran a custom-built workbench holding two laptop computers, their screens dark but their indicator lights glowing to show they were powered on and running. Next to the computers were several pieces of scientific equipment that Sarah recognized from her years at Apex. A portable mass spectrometer, a turbidity meter, pH testing devices, and what looked like a high-end water quality analyzer. Secured against the opposite wall were tall filing cabinets, the heavy-duty metal kind used for storing important documents, each drawer labeled with dates and locations. A small but efficient propane heater sat on the floor, connected to a tank and running steadily, filling the space with the warmth that had likely saved Emma's life. Near the back of the van was a compact generator, its quiet hum providing power to all the equipment, and several large plastic containers that Sarah guessed held water and fuel. The van's rear windows had been covered from the inside with reflective material, providing privacy and insulation, and the floor was lined with industrial rubber matting. It was clear that whoever owned this van had spent considerable time and money outfitting it for serious fieldwork, for extended periods of independent operation away from any laboratory or office. Sarah climbed inside, still carrying Emma, and set the girl down gently on a folding cot that was tucked against one wall, immediately wrapping her in a thick wool blanket she found folded nearby. Bear jumped in after them, shaking snow from his coat, and Sarah pulled the door closed behind them, shutting out the lethal cold. As the warmth began to penetrate her frozen limbs, bringing with it the sharp pain of returning circulation, Sarah's eyes fell on something taped to the dashboard just behind the driver's seat. It was a piece of paper, ordinary notebook paper, covered in neat handwriting. She moved closer, her heart beginning to pound with a new kind of fear, and read the words that would change everything. To whoever finds this, I'm probably dead. What's in here can save thousands. Don't let them bury it. Dr. Marcus Webb. Sarah pulled Emma closer to the heater, wrapping the child in every blanket she could find in the van, watching as color slowly, painfully returned to her daughter's pale cheeks. As the violent shivering gradually subsided into occasional tremors, as Emma's eyes, which had been glazed and unfocused, began to clear and track movement again. Bear curled protectively around Emma on the cot, his warm bulk providing additional insulation, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the small space. Only when Sarah was certain that Emma was stable, that her daughter was no longer in immediate danger of hypothermia, did she allow herself to turn her attention to the contents of the van, to the mystery of Dr. Marcus Webb and what he had died to protect. She moved to the filing cabinets, her hands still clumsy from the cold, and pulled open the first drawer. Inside were hundreds of manila folders, each one labeled with a location name, GPS coordinates, and a date. She pulled out a folder at random, one labeled Stillwater River Site 7, June 2022, and opened it. What she found inside made her breath catch in her throat. The folder contained detailed laboratory analysis reports for water and soil samples, professional photographs of a remote area showing barrels partially buried in dirt, and a typed summary documenting levels of arsenic, lead, and industrial solvents that were hundreds of times above EPA safety limits. Clipped to the summary was a copy of an official environmental impact report filed with the state of Montana by Apex Environmental Services, a report she recognized immediately because it bore the company's distinctive letterhead and filing stamps. The Apex report declared the site clean, the water safe, the soil uncontaminated. Dr. Webb's independent tests told a completely different story. Sarah's hands began to shake as she opened another folder, then another, then another. Each one followed the same devastating pattern, Webb's legitimate scientific analysis showing dangerous contamination, and Apex's falsified reports declaring everything safe. The locations spanned the entire state of Montana, from Kalispell in the northwest to Miles City in the southeast, dozens of sites, perhaps hundreds. She moved to the second filing cabinet and found more of the same, years and years of evidence, meticulously documented, photographed, and cross-referenced. The third cabinet contained large rolled maps that, when spread out on the workbench, revealed something even more horrifying. Webb had created a comprehensive contamination map of Montana, marking every site he had tested in red, with lines showing how the pollutants were spreading through groundwater systems, following the natural flow of aquifers and underground streams. Entire watersheds were marked as compromised. Entire counties shown in gradients of red, indicating different levels of toxic exposure. And on every single map, in neat annotations along the margins, was the name of the company that had certified these sites as safe, Apex Environmental Services. Sarah sank onto the small stool by the workbench, her mind reeling with the implications of what she was seeing. This was not just the isolated fraud she had discovered 3 months ago, the handful of falsified reports that had cost her everything. This was systematic, deliberate, massive in scope, spanning decades. Apex had built its entire business model on lying, on selling environmental approval to companies that were poisoning the land, the water, the people of Montana. And she had worked for them, had been part of this machine, albeit unknowingly, for 6 years. Dr. Marcus Webb had apparently spent months, perhaps years, conducting independent tests, building an airtight case against Apex, documenting their crimes with scientific precision. And they had killed him for it. Sarah was certain of that now. The note on the dashboard was not paranoia but prophecy. Sarah turned her attention to the laptops on the workbench, both of which were still running, their screens dark from inactivity, but coming to life with a gentle touch to their trackpads. The first laptop was password protected, its screen displaying a generic login prompt that Sarah had no hope of bypassing, but the second one opened immediately to a desktop cluttered with folders and documents. Sarah clicked on the most recent folder, labeled simply Journal, and found herself reading the private thoughts of a dead man. The entries were dated, spanning back nearly 8 months, and they told a story that was both fascinating and terrifying. Dr. Marcus Webb had been a respected environmental scientist based in Bozeman, an independent contractor who did analysis work for various agencies and organizations. 7 months ago, he had been contacted by an investigative journalist named Claire Hartley from the Montana Standard, who was looking into allegations of environmental fraud in the state. Claire had received anonymous tips suggesting that Apex Environmental Services was falsifying pollution reports, and she needed someone with scientific credentials to verify her suspicions. Webb had agreed to help, initially approaching it as a straightforward consulting job, running independent tests on sites that Apex had certified as clean. What he found in those first few tests had shocked him. The contamination was not minor, not borderline violations that might result from incompetence or outdated equipment, but massive, deliberate poisoning that Apex had systematically covered up. Webb's journal entries grew increasingly alarmed as he expanded his investigation, testing site after site, finding the same pattern of falsification everywhere he looked. He wrote about his growing conviction that this was not just corporate malfeasance, but criminal conspiracy, on a scale that dwarfed anything he had encountered in his 30-year career. The journal entries from 5 months ago took on a darker tone. Webb began to suspect he was being followed, that his phone calls were being monitored, that his hotel rooms were being searched when he was away. He wrote about strange vehicles parked outside his apartment, about conversations with Claire Hartley where she expressed similar concerns, about the crawling sensation of being watched. Then, 3 months ago, the threats became explicit. Webb documented receiving an anonymous phone call warning him to stop his investigation, to destroy his data, to forget what he had found. He wrote about finding his laboratory broken into, equipment smashed, samples destroyed. He reported these incidents to the police, but the responses were perfunctory, dismissive, as if the officers taking his statements did not take his concerns seriously, or perhaps did not want to take them seriously. The final entries, dated just 2 weeks ago, were written in the clipped, urgent prose of a man who knew he was running out of time. Webb described his decision to go into hiding, to convert his work van into a mobile laboratory that he could use to stay one step ahead of whoever was hunting him. He wrote about parking the van in different locations each night, about conducting tests in the early morning hours when he thought he would not be observed, about his growing certainty that he would not survive long enough to see his evidence presented in court. The second-to-last entry described his decision to leave the van as a dead drop, a term he must have learned from spy novels, parking it in the industrial district where it might be overlooked but could potentially be found by someone who needed it. The final entry, dated exactly 14 days ago, contained only 3 sentences that Sarah read with a chill running down her spine. "They found me. I won't make it out. This is my testimony." Sarah was so absorbed in reading Webb's journal, in following the tragic trajectory of a good man's final days, that she did not immediately notice that Emma had recovered enough to sit up on the cot, that the warmth and safety of the van had worked their restorative magic on her daughter's young, resilient body. It was Bear who drew her attention, the dog letting out a soft, insistent whine that was different from his earlier urgent calls in the alley. Sarah looked up from the laptop screen to see that Emma was now standing, wrapped in the wool blanket like a shawl, watching Bear with curious interest as the dog pawed at something near the back door of the van. Bear was not being destructive or random in his movements. Sarah could see that immediately. He was focused on a specific spot, a section of the van's interior wall paneling that looked identical to all the other panels but clearly held some significance that only the dog's superior senses could detect. Bear scratched at the panel's edge with his front paw, whined again, then looked at Emma as if asking for help. Emma, who had spent enough time with Bear to understand his communication style almost as well as Sarah did, moved closer and knelt beside the dog, running her small hands over the panel where Bear was indicating. "Mom," Emma said, her voice still hoarse from the cold but stronger than it had been, "I think there's something here. It feels different." Sarah joined them at the back of the van, and together she and Emma examined the panel more closely. It was cleverly concealed, the seams almost invisible, but when Sarah pressed on one corner, she felt a slight give, a depression that triggered a hidden latch. The panel popped open to reveal a narrow compartment behind it, a space perhaps 8 inches wide and a foot tall, custom-built into the van's structure. Inside the compartment was a single, small, waterproof box, the kind designed for protecting electronics and documents in harsh conditions. Sarah lifted it out carefully, her heart pounding with anticipation, and carried it to the workbench where the light was better. Emma stood close beside her, Bear pressing against both of them, as Sarah opened the waterproof seal. Inside were 4 items that Webb had considered important enough to hide with extra care, to protect beyond the protection offered by locked filing cabinets and password-protected computers. The first 3 items were USB flash drives, each one labeled in Webb's neat handwriting. The first was labeled Apex Executive Communications, the second Payment Records, and the third, most chilling of all, Body Count. Sarah held that third drive in her hand, staring at the two words, understanding immediately what Webb had meant. This was not just about environmental crime, about poisoned water and contaminated soil. This was about people who had died, victims whose deaths could be traced back to the toxic waste that Apex had certified as safe, a body count that someone had bothered to document and preserve. The fourth item in the box was a simple prepaid cell phone, a burner phone of the type that could be purchased with cash at any convenience store, leaving no paper trail, no connection to the buyer's identity. Sarah powered it on, surprised to find it still held a charge, and navigated to the contacts. There was only one number saved, one name that Webb had deemed important enough to preserve, FBI Environmental Crimes Division. Sarah stared at the phone, her hand trembling, understanding the full weight of what she now possessed. Dr. Marcus Webb had spent his final days creating a comprehensive, irrefutable case against Apex Environmental Services, documenting not just their fraud but the human cost of their crimes, and he had prepared a direct line to the federal agency with the power to bring them to justice. Sarah sat at the workbench, staring at the USB drives and the phone, Emma standing close beside her, when a terrible thought began to form in her mind, a connection that she had been too overwhelmed to make until this moment. She reached for one of the large contamination maps that she had spread out earlier, the comprehensive overview of Montana that showed all of Webb's documented sites in red, and she traced her finger across it, searching for a specific location. Her hand stopped over Billings, over the neighborhood on the city's northeast side where she and Emma had lived for the past 4 years, where they had rented their small 2-bedroom apartment in an aging complex called Meadowview Gardens. The map showed a large red circle encompassing that exact area, marked with Webb's notation, Site 23, Billings Northeast Aquifer, severe heavy metal contamination. Arsenic levels 340 times. EPA limits, lead present, industrial solvents detected. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her, felt a roaring in her ears that had nothing to do with the heater or the generator. She pulled out the filing cabinet drawer, her hands moving with frantic urgency now, searching for the folder that corresponded to Site 23. She found it, thick with documentation, and spread its contents across the workbench. The photographs showed a location she recognized, an old industrial park less than half a mile from Meadowview Gardens, a cluster of abandoned factories and warehouses that had been closed since the 1982nd. Webb's investigation had revealed that the site had been used for decades as an illegal dumping ground for industrial waste, that the contaminants had leached into the groundwater, that the entire aquifer feeding the northeast side of Billings was compromised. The water coming out of their taps, the water Emma had drunk every day for 4 years, the water they had used to cook and bathe, had been poisoned. Sarah's mind raced backward through the past year, through Emma's increasingly frequent illnesses, the respiratory infections that had started last winter and never fully cleared, the persistent cough that doctors had attributed to asthma, the strange rashes that appeared and disappeared without explanation, the exhaustion that had made Emma fall asleep in school, the nosebleeds that had become so common Sarah had stopped worrying about them. Every symptom was consistent with chronic heavy metal exposure, with arsenic and lead poisoning, with the slow, insidious damage that toxic waste inflicted on developing bodies. Emma had been sick, not because she was weak or unlucky, but because she was being poisoned, systematically and invisibly, by the very water that was supposed to sustain life. And Apex Environmental Services, the company Sarah had worked for, the company that had fired her for daring to question their integrity, had certified that site as safe. She found the document in Webb's folder, an official Apex report dated 3 years ago, signed by Richard Cole, her former supervisor, declaring that the Billings Northeast industrial site posed no environmental risk, that groundwater testing had revealed no contamination, that residential development in the area could proceed without concern. It was a lie, a calculated, murderous lie that had allowed the apartment complex to remain open, had allowed families like Sarah's to continue living in a contaminated zone, drinking poisoned water, breathing air that carried particulates from contaminated soil. This was not abstract corporate malfeasance anymore, not distant crimes committed against strangers in places Sarah had never been. This was personal, intimate, a violation that reached into her home and touched her daughter's body. Apex had not just destroyed Sarah's career and her livelihood when she discovered their fraud. They had been poisoning Emma, slowly killing her child, for years before that, and they had done it knowingly, deliberately, with full awareness of the harm they were causing. Sarah looked at Emma, who stood wrapped in the blanket, her face still pale, her eyes watching her mother with concern, and she felt something crystallize inside her. Something cold and hard and utterly unbreakable. This was no longer about survival, about finding shelter or food, or making it through another frozen night. This was about justice, about ensuring that the people who had done this would face consequences, that the company that had poisoned her daughter and killed God knew how many others would be held accountable. Sarah had made the decision that they would spend the night in the van, that the risk of being discovered was worth the certainty of warmth and shelter. And after feeding Emma some protein bars she found in Webb's supplies and giving Bear water from one of the containers, she had bedded down on the floor with blankets while Emma took the cot. The heater continued its steady work, the generator hummed its reassuring song, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Sarah felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen slightly as she drifted toward sleep. Emma's steady breathing and Bear's warm presence creating an illusion of safety that was almost overwhelming in its sweetness. She did not know how long she had been asleep, whether it was minutes or hours, when Bear's low growl pulled her back to waking consciousness with the sharp urgency of an alarm. The dog was on his feet, his body rigid, his attention fixed on the van's front windshield, his growl a continuous rumble that spoke of immediate threat. Sarah sat up instantly, her military wife's instincts from years married to a soldier kicking in, her body moving before her mind fully processed what was happening. She crawled to the front of the van and peered carefully through a small gap in the reflective material covering the windshield, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. 2 men were moving through the warehouse lot, sweeping powerful flashlight beams across the snow-covered ground, examining every vehicle, every shadow, every potential hiding place. They wore dark jackets with Apex Security emblazoned across the back in reflective letters, and they moved with the practiced coordination of professionals conducting a methodical search. They were perhaps 50 yards away, working their way steadily closer to the loading dock area where Webb's van was hidden. Sarah watched, barely breathing, as one of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, stopped and raised a radio to his mouth. In the profound silence of the frozen night, his voice carried clearly across the empty lot, amplified by the cold air and the hard surfaces of concrete and brick. Unit 2 to base. We've covered the East Industrial Sector. No sign of the target vehicle. Webb's van isn't at his apartment, isn't at any of his known locations. Where the hell did he hide it? There was a crackle of static, then a different voice, female and crisp with authority, responded through the radio. Keep searching. Expand to all warehouse districts. The boss wants everything Webb had destroyed before the EPA audit next week. That van is a mobile lab. If those files get out, we're all going to prison. Find it. The tall man acknowledged the order and gestured to his partner, a shorter, stockier figure, and they turned their attention directly toward the loading dock area. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized they were heading straight for their position. The men would reach the van in less than 2 minutes. She moved with silent, desperate speed, crawling to the back of the van where the generator sat humming. She found the kill switch, hesitated for just a fraction of a second as she considered what turning it off would mean, the cold that would begin to creep back in, the darkness that would envelop them, but she had no choice. If the men heard the generator or saw any sign of activity, if they investigated the van and found Sarah and Emma inside with all of Webb's evidence, they would not simply confiscate the documents. They would eliminate the witnesses. Sarah flipped the switch. The generator's hum died instantly, and a heartbeat later, the heater shut off, the LED strips went dark, and the van was plunged into absolute darkness and silence. She crawled back to Emma, placed her hand gently over her daughter's mouth before the girl could speak or cry out in alarm, and whispered directly into her ear, "Don't move, don't make a sound. No matter what happens." Bear, understanding the danger with an animal's perfect clarity, pressed himself flat against the floor. His growling ceased, but his body vibrating with coiled tension, ready to defend them if the men opened the door. Sarah held Emma close in the absolute darkness, feeling her daughter's heart racing against her own chest, while Bear remained frozen in his protective stance between them and the door. A silent gray sentinel whose every muscle was coiled and ready to explode into action if the threat materialized. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the crunch of boots on snow and ice approaching with terrible inevitability. Through the tiny gap in the reflective window covering, Sarah could see the beams of the flashlight sweeping closer, illuminating the concrete loading dock, the brick wall, the narrow space where Webb had hidden his van. The taller guard was now only 10 feet away, his light playing across the van's exterior, and Sarah heard him say to his partner, "Check this one. White cargo van. That matches the description." Her hand tightened on Emma, her other hand moving to Bear's collar, ready to restrain him if he tried to attack, knowing that any sound, any movement, would give them away. The shorter guard moved toward the driver's side door while the tall one approached the side door, the very door through which Sarah had entered just hours earlier. She could see his shadow now, a dark shape blocking what little ambient light penetrated their hiding place. His gloved hand reached for the door handle, and Sarah felt time slow to a crawl, felt every second stretch into an eternity as she prepared for discovery, for confrontation, for whatever violence would follow when these men found not an empty van but witnesses to their conspiracy. Bear's body tensed further, a barely audible growl starting deep in his throat, and Sarah knew that if that door opened, the dog would launch himself at the threat without hesitation, would fight to protect Emma even against impossible odds. The guard's fingers closed around the handle, began to pull, and in that instant, a new sound cut through the frozen night. A sound so unexpected and so perfectly timed that Sarah would later wonder if some divine intervention had orchestrated it. It was the sharp electronic whoop of a police siren, brief and authoritative, followed by the crunch of tires on snow as a Billings Police Department cruiser pulled into the warehouse lot, its headlights sweeping across the area, its spotlight snapping on to illuminate the 2 Apex security guards in brilliant white light. Sarah watched through her tiny gap as the tall guard jerked his hand away from the van door, as both men turned to face the police cruiser with expressions of surprise and annoyance. A uniformed officer stepped out of the cruiser, his hand resting casually on his belt near his service weapon, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Evening, gentlemen. We got a call about suspicious activity in this area, possible trespassing. You have business here?" The tall guard recovered quickly, his voice smooth and professional as he held up an identification badge. "Apex Security, officer. We're conducting a routine patrol of client properties in the industrial district. This is all authorized." The officer examined the badge with his flashlight, taking his time, and Sarah could see the guards shifting their weight, impatient to return to their search but unwilling to appear uncooperative with law enforcement. After what felt like an eternity, the officer nodded. "All right, but this particular lot doesn't belong to any Apex clients according to our records. I'm going to need you to clear out. If you need to patrol other areas, that's fine, but not here." The guards exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the calculation happening, the weighing of options. The decision that arguing with a police officer over access to an abandoned lot would draw more attention than it was worth. The tall guard nodded curtly. "Understood, officer. We'll move along." They walked away, their flashlights dark now, heading back toward their vehicle parked somewhere beyond Sarah's line of sight, and the police officer watched them go before conducting his own brief sweep of the lot with his spotlight, the beam passing over Webb's van but not lingering, not investigating. Finally, the cruiser pulled away, and Sarah was left in darkness and silence once more, her heart still hammering, her arms still wrapped around Emma. They had escaped discovery by seconds, by the random chance of a police patrol, but Sarah understood with perfect clarity that chance would not save them a second time. Sarah waited in the darkness of the van for another hour, until she was certain the Apex gods had truly left the area, until the adrenaline coursing through her veins had subsided enough for her hands to stop shaking. And then she made a decision. They could not stay here, could not remain in this industrial wasteland where Webb's van had already been identified as a target, where the next search would be more thorough, where there would be no convenient police cruiser to interrupt discovery. She needed help, needed allies, needed someone she could trust in a world that had shown her nothing but betrayal and cruelty for 3 months. As she sat in the cold darkness, Emma finally asleep again despite the terror they had just survived, Bear's warm head resting on her lap, a name surfaced in her memory: Father Thomas O'Brien from St. Mary's Catholic Church on the west side of Billings. She and Emma had gone there twice in their weeks on the streets, drawn by signs advertising a soup kitchen and food pantry, and Father Thomas had been the one serving meals, a tall, lean man in his 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, who had spoken to Emma with gentle humor and had pressed an extra sandwich into Sarah's hand without making her feel like a charity case. She remembered that he had asked her name, had asked if there was anything else the church could do to help, and she remembered the way he had looked at her, not with pity but with a sort of recognition, as if he understood something about her situation that went deeper than simple homelessness. It was a slim thread of hope, but it was all she had. Sarah carefully started the van's engine, keeping the lights off, and navigated out of the industrial district using only the faint illumination of distant streetlights and the moon that had finally emerged from behind the clouds. She drove through the silent, frozen streets of Billings in the pre-dawn hours, when the city was still asleep, when the only other vehicles on the road were snowplows and the occasional delivery truck. And she made her way across town to the neighborhood where St. Mary's stood, a modest brick church with a white steeple that was just beginning to be silhouetted against the lightening eastern sky. She pulled the van into the church parking lot and sat for a moment, gathering her courage, wondering if she was about to make a terrible mistake, if Father Thomas would turn her away or worse, if he would call the authorities, if she was putting Emma in even greater danger by revealing themselves. But she had no other options, no other connections, no other path forward that did not lead to freezing or capture. She climbed out of the van, leaving Emma and Bear inside where it was warmer, and walked to the church's side entrance. The one she remembered led to the administrative offices. She knocked, softly at first, then louder, and after a long moment, she heard footsteps. The door opened to reveal Father Thomas, already dressed despite the early hour, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he recognized her. "Sarah," he said, her name coming to him immediately, proof that she had not been just another nameless face in the soup kitchen line. "What's happened? Are you all right?" The kindness in his voice, the genuine concern without judgment or suspicion, broke something inside her. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since this nightmare had begun, felt the weight of 3 months of terror and exhaustion pressing down on her. "Father," she said, her voice breaking, "I need help, I need sanctuary. And I need you to believe me when I tell you that some very dangerous people are looking for me, not because I've done anything wrong, but because I know the truth about something terrible." Father Thomas had listened to Sarah's story in the quiet of his office, the van hidden in the church's garage, Emma and Bear sleeping in a warm room in the basement that the church used for emergency shelter. And when Sarah finished speaking, when she had laid out everything about Apex and Webb and the evidence and the guards searching in the night, the priest had sat back in his chair with an expression that was both grave and unsurprised, as if the capacity of humans to commit evil for profit was something his years as an army chaplain had taught him to expect. He had made a single phone call, and within an hour, a woman arrived at the church, a woman in her early 70s with steel-gray hair cut short and practical, sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the brisk, efficient manner of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating bureaucracy and law. Father Thomas introduced her as his sister, Margaret O'Brien, a retired paralegal who had spent 30 years working for Montana's Department of Environmental Quality, before taking early retirement in what Father Thomas described with careful neutrality as a disagreement over priorities. Margaret had taken one look at Sarah, had asked 3 pointed questions about the van and its contents, and had said simply, "Show me everything." For the next 6 hours, Margaret had worked in the church basement, spreading Webb's files across folding tables, booting up his laptops, examining his maps and photographs and laboratory reports with the focused intensity of a prosecutor building a case. Sarah had helped where she could, organizing documents, explaining what she understood from her own time at Apex, watching as Margaret's expression grew progressively darker, as the retired paralegal's lips pressed into a thin, tight line that spoke of anger held barely in check. When Margaret finally looked up from the last folder, from the last USB drive, from the comprehensive horror of what Dr. Time, Marcus Webb, had documented, her voice was steady but her hands trembled slightly as she removed her glasses to rub her tired eyes. "This is the most extensive corporate criminal conspiracy I have ever seen," Margaret said, her professional composure cracking just slightly. "Dr. Webb documented systematic environmental fraud by Apex Environmental Services spanning 15 years. Falsified reports for 47 different companies across Montana, illegal dumping of toxic waste at hundreds of sites, contamination of groundwater systems that serve an estimated 100,000 people, maybe more. She pulled out a spreadsheet that Webb had meticulously maintained, a financial analysis that tracked money flowing from corporate clients to Apex, and then from Apex to a network of individuals whose names Sarah did not recognize but whose titles Margaret identified immediately. State environmental inspectors, county health officials, members of the Montana Environmental Review Board, and even a deputy director in the Department of Environmental Quality itself. The payment records showed millions of dollars in bribes, disguised as consulting fees, speaking honorariums, and charitable donations, creating a web of corruption that had allowed Apex to operate with impunity for more than a decade. Margaret's finger traced the flow of money, the intricate system of payoffs that had transformed environmental protection from a public trust into a profit center for those willing to sell their integrity. "This isn't just about Apex Environmental Services," Margaret said, looking at Sarah with an expression that mixed admiration and fear. "This is a statewide conspiracy involving dozens of officials at multiple levels of government." Dr. Webb didn't just find evidence of corporate fraud. He found evidence of institutional corruption, of a system that was deliberately broken to serve private interests at the expense of public health. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. "And that means the danger you're in is far greater than you understand, because these people have everything to lose, and they have the resources and connections to eliminate threats. Dr. Webb is dead because of what's in these files, and now you're carrying that same target." Emma had spent the first day in the church basement sleeping, her small body recovering from the weeks of deprivation and the near-death experience of the coldest night. But by the second day, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah watched as her daughter, who had become increasingly withdrawn and silent during their time on the streets, who had seemed to fold in on herself under the weight of their circumstances, began to emerge from that protective shell. Emma sat at one of the folding tables where Margaret was working, watching the older woman sort through files and documents with evident fascination, and after perhaps an hour of silent observation, she asked her first question, "What are you looking for?" Margaret had looked up, surprised, and had answered honestly rather than dismissing the child. "I'm trying to establish a chronological sequence of events, to show when each crime was committed and how they connect to each other." Emma had nodded, processing this information, and then she had asked if she could help. What started as simple tasks, Emma sorting documents by date, organizing photographs by location, quickly evolved into something more sophisticated as Margaret recognized that the 12-year-old girl had a sharp, analytical mind that had been starved for intellectual engagement during their weeks of survival. Emma began creating a visual timeline on a long roll of paper that Father Thomas provided, marking each contamination site Webb had documented, noting when Apex had filed its false reports, when payments had been made to officials, creating a comprehensive map of the conspiracy that was easier to follow than columns of data in spreadsheets. She worked with quiet intensity, asking Margaret questions about legal terminology, about how evidence was presented in court, about what would be needed to prove criminal intent, and Margaret answered each question with increasing respect for the child's intelligence. On the third day, as Sarah was reviewing another set of laboratory reports, Emma set down her marker and turned to her mother with an expression that was far older than her 12 years, an expression that held understanding and pain and a kind of fierce clarity. "Mom," Emma said, her voice steady, "I get it now. I understand why we lost everything, why you got fired, why they kicked us out, why no one would help us." Sarah felt her throat tighten, wanting to protect her daughter from this knowledge, from the harsh truth of how the world actually worked. But Emma continued before she could speak. "You weren't fired because you were difficult or because you made a mistake. You were fired because you were right, because you found out what they were doing and they couldn't let you tell anyone. They took everything from us because you were trying to stop them from hurting people. From hurting me." Her voice wavered slightly on those last two words, and Sarah moved to embrace her, but Emma held up a hand, needing to finish what she was saying. "I was sick all last year because of them, because of the water in our apartment, because of what they let those companies dump in the ground. Dr. Webb figured that out, and they killed him for it. And now we have all his evidence, and we have to make sure everyone knows what they did, because if we don't, they'll just keep poisoning people, keep killing people, and no one will stop them." She looked at Sarah with eyes that held a determination that was heartbreaking in its maturity. "We're not just homeless people who got unlucky, Mom. We're witnesses. We know the truth, and that makes us important. That makes us dangerous to them, but it also makes us the only ones who can get justice for Dr. Webb and for all the people they hurt. Sarah pulled Emma into her arms then, holding her daughter close, feeling a transformation in her own heart, a shift from the defeated, exhausted woman who had been focused purely on survival to something harder, something forged in the crucible of injustice. Sarah held the burner phone in her hand for a long time before she found the courage to dial the single contact saved in its memory, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical thing. Margaret had advised caution, had warned that once they reached out to the FBI, there would be no taking it back, no retreat into anonymity. But Emma's words had crystallized something inside Sarah, had transformed her from a victim trying to survive into a witness determined to testify. She sat in the quiet church basement, Father Thomas and Margaret nearby for moral support, Emma sleeping in the next room with Bear curled protectively around her, and she pressed the call button, listening to the phone ring once, twice, 3 times, before a woman's voice answered with crisp professionalism. Environmental Crimes Division, Special Agent Chen speaking. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she began. Agent Chen, my name is Sarah Winters. I'm calling from Billings, Montana. 2 weeks ago, I found a van belonging to Dr. Marcus Webb, an environmental scientist who I believe was murdered because of what he discovered. The van contains comprehensive evidence of a massive environmental fraud conspiracy involving Apex Environmental Services and numerous state officials. I have files, laboratory reports, payment records, and documentation of systematic contamination affecting over 100,000 people. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched long enough for Sarah to wonder if the agent thought she was a crank caller, someone delusional or attention-seeking. But when Chen spoke again, her voice had shifted from routine professionalism to sharp, focused interest. Mrs. Winters, I need you to slow down and start from the beginning. Tell me exactly how you came into possession of this evidence, what your connection is to Dr. Webb, and why you believe his death was not accidental. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah laid out the entire story, from her discovery of fraud at Apex 3 months ago, to her firing and homelessness, to the night Bear had led them to Webb's hidden van, to the security guards searching for it, to everything Margaret had found in the files. She spoke clearly and methodically, anticipating Chen's questions, providing specific details that would prove she was not fabricating her story. She mentioned the note Webb had left on the dashboard, the journal entries describing threats against his life, the systematic pattern of falsification spanning 15 years. Chen listened without interrupting, and Sarah could hear the faint sound of typing in the background, the agent taking notes, recording the conversation. When Sarah finished, Chen asked a series of pointed questions about the evidence, about what specifically was contained in the files, about whether Sarah had contacted anyone else, about where she was currently located. Sarah answered honestly, explaining about Father Thomas and Street, Mary's church, about Margaret's help organizing the documentation, about the fact that she was hiding because Apex Security was actively searching for the van. Chen was silent for a moment, and Sarah could almost hear the calculations happening, the weighing of credibility against the enormity of the allegations. Mrs. Winters, Chen finally said, her voice taking on a tone of command, I'm going to give you an email address for a secure server. I need you to upload files from one of those USB drives, enough for me to verify that what you're describing is legitimate. Can you do that? Margaret, who had been listening on speaker, nodded and gestured to Webb's laptop. Yes, Sarah said. We can do that right now. Chen provided the encrypted email address, and Margaret took over, selecting files from the USB drive labeled Payment Records, uploading financial documents, bank transfers, emails between Apex executives and state officials, creating a compressed file that contained perhaps 10% of Webb's total evidence but enough to prove the scope of the conspiracy. The upload took 12 minutes, and when it was complete, Chen confirmed receipt and said, I'm reviewing these files now. Stay on the line. Sarah waited, her heart pounding, listening to the sound of Chen's breathing, the occasional muttered comment as the agent examined the evidence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than an hour, Chen spoke again, her voice now carrying the weight of someone who had just seen something that changed everything. Stay where you are. Do not contact anyone else. Do not move that van. We're opening an investigation. 2 days passed in tense waiting, days during which Sarah jumped at every sound outside the church. Days during which Margaret continued organizing evidence while Father Thomas arranged for Emma to have proper meals and clean clothes donated by parishioners. Days during which Agent Chen called twice with brief updates that the investigation was proceeding but that Sarah needed to remain patient, that building a case of this magnitude took time. On the morning of the third day, Father Thomas came down to the basement where Sarah was helping Emma with her timeline, his face grave, carrying a tablet computer. "You need to see this," he said quietly, pulling up the website for KTVQ, the local NBC affiliate in Billings. The headline video featured a press conference from earlier that morning, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the woman standing at a podium adorned with the Apex Environmental Services logo. Victoria Crane was perhaps 50 years old, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, her dark hair styled in a professional bob, her expression one of practiced sympathy, as she addressed a small gathering of reporters in what appeared to be Apex's corporate headquarters. Sarah turned up the volume and listened as Crane spoke in a smooth, measured voice that conveyed just the right blend of sorrow and corporate responsibility. "On behalf of everyone at Apex Environmental Services, I want to express our deepest condolences to the family and friends of Dr. Marcus Webb, who tragically died in a hiking accident in the mountains west of Bozeman 2 weeks ago. Dr. Webb was a respected member of Montana's environmental science community, and his loss is felt deeply by all who knew him." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as Crane continued. "While Dr. Webb sometimes worked as an independent contractor rather than directly with companies like ours, we recognize the value of his contributions to environmental research in our state. To honor his memory and his commitment to scientific education, Apex Environmental Services is establishing the Marcus Webb Memorial Scholarship, a $50,000 annual award that will be given to Montana students pursuing degrees in environmental science. We hope this scholarship will continue Dr. Webb's legacy of dedication to protecting our state's natural resources." The press conference continued with Crane taking a few softball questions from reporters who seemed to accept her narrative without challenge, thanking her for Apex's generosity, asking about the details of the scholarship program, and Crane deflecting with practiced ease any question that might have probed deeper into Webb's actual relationship with Apex or the circumstances of his death. When the video ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just witnessed. Margaret spoke first, her voice tight with controlled anger. "A hiking accident. They're establishing the official story, creating a narrative that explains his death as a tragedy rather than a murder, and they're doing it publicly, generously, in a way that makes them look sympathetic and community-minded." But Sarah was focused on something else, something far more terrifying than Apex's public relations strategy. "They know he's dead," she said slowly, the realization settling over her like a shroud. "They know Webb is dead, which means they know they succeeded in killing him, which means they've confirmed his body was found, or they found it themselves. But more than that, they're doing this press conference now, specifically now, establishing this narrative about a hiking accident and a generous scholarship. They're trying to control the story before something else comes out, before someone questions the official version of his death." She looked at Margaret and Father Thomas, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Agent Chen said not to contact anyone else, said they were opening an investigation. That was 2 days ago. And now, 48 hours later, Apex is holding a press conference to memorialize Webb and paint themselves as the good guys. That's not a coincidence. Someone told them. Someone inside law enforcement, someone who knew about the FBI investigation, leaked information to Apex. The weight of that realization was crushing. The understanding that the corruption Webb had documented went even deeper than the files suggested, that it extended into the very institutions that were supposed to bring criminals to justice, that their enemies had eyes and ears inside the system they had trusted to protect them. That night, as darkness settled over Billings and the temperature dropped into the single digits, Sarah was in the church basement with Emma and Margaret, reviewing another set of Webb's files. When Bear suddenly rose from his position near Emma's feet, his entire body going rigid in the way that meant only one thing: threat detected. The dog moved silently to the small window near the ceiling that looked out at street level, his hackles rising along his spine, transforming his normally sleek coat into a bristling ridge of silver and white fur. A low, continuous growl rumbling in his chest that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. She moved quickly to the window, standing on a chair to peer out at the street, and what she saw made her stomach clench with fear. A black Cadillac Escalade, its windows tinted so dark they were nearly opaque, had pulled up directly in front of the church and parked at the curb, its engine running, exhaust rising in white plumes into the frozen air. The vehicle was immaculate, expensive, completely out of place in this modest working-class neighborhood where the other cars on the street were aging sedans and pickup trucks with rust spots and dented fenders. As Sarah watched, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, and everything about him screamed wealth and power and danger. He was perhaps 45 years old, tall and fit, wearing a long black wool overcoat that probably cost more than Sarah had earned in a month at Apex, his shoes polished leather, his hair precisely cut, his face clean-shaven and unremarkable except for the cold, assessing quality of his eyes as he stood on the sidewalk and studied the church with the focused attention of a predator evaluating its prey. He made no move to approach the building, simply stood there in the cold, his breath visible, his gaze sweeping across the church's facade, the parking lot, the surrounding buildings, cataloging details, gathering intelligence. Sarah ducked down from the window, her heart racing, and whispered urgently, "Someone's here, watching the church." Father Thomas, who had been in his office upstairs, must have noticed the vehicle as well, because moments later Sarah heard the church's front door open and saw through the window as the priest stepped out onto the front steps. Moving with the calm authority of a man who had faced far worse threats than a stranger in an expensive coat, the priest walked directly toward the man, and Sarah could see them speaking, though she could not hear the words through the glass. The conversation lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Father Thomas's body language relaxed but firm, the stranger's posture defensive, and then the man gestured vaguely at the church, at the neighborhood, offering what appeared to be an explanation. Finally, Father Thomas nodded, the stranger returned to his vehicle, and the Escalade pulled away, disappearing down the street. When Father Thomas returned to the basement, his expression was grim. He claimed to be a concerned citizen from the neighborhood association. The priest said, his voice heavy with skepticism, said he was worried about transients using the church facilities, said there had been complaints about homeless people loitering in the area. Said he wanted to make sure we weren't creating a public nuisance. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "This neighborhood doesn't have a neighborhood association, Thomas. I checked the city records when you first bought this property 15 years ago." Father Thomas nodded. "I know." And that man was no concerned citizen. His coat alone cost $5,000, and he was wearing a Patek Philippe watch. He's corporate security, private investigation, something like that. He was gathering information, confirming that you're here, assessing our defenses. Sarah felt the walls closing in, felt the safety of their sanctuary dissolving like smoke. They found us. Somehow, they tracked us here. Victoria Crane has the resources of a major corporation behind her, unlimited money to hire investigators, to pay for information, to monitor communications. We're not safe here anymore. Sarah could not sleep that night, her mind racing with the knowledge that they had been found, that the man in the expensive coat had stood outside the church and assessed them like a hunter sizing up prey. And in her restlessness, she returned to Webb's belongings, to the items she had not yet fully examined in the chaos of survival and evidence compilation. She pulled out the laptop case, a worn leather bag that showed years of use, its corners scuffed and its zipper slightly stuck, and as she opened it to retrieve a charging cable, something slipped out from an interior pocket and fell to the floor. It was a photograph, printed on quality paper, slightly faded at the edges, but carefully preserved in a protective plastic sleeve. Sarah picked it up and found herself looking at a much younger Marcus Webb, perhaps in his early 50s rather than the 60-something man whose journal entries she had read, standing in what appeared to be a university auditorium decorated with banners and academic regalia. He was shaking hands with a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, who was wearing a graduation gown and holding what looked like a diploma or certificate, her face radiant with pride and accomplishment. Her dark hair longer than she wore it now, but her features unmistakable. It was Victoria Crane. Sarah turned the photograph over with trembling hands and found writing on the back, Webb's distinctive neat script, the same handwriting that had filled his journals and labeled his files. "My brightest student, I'm so proud. 2003. The date was 22 years ago, back when Crane would have been fresh out of graduate school. When Webb would have been at the height of his career as a professor and researcher, when the relationship between mentor and student would have been one of trust and shared passion for environmental science." Sarah sat down heavily on the chair, staring at the photograph, her mind reeling with the implications of this discovery. Victoria Crane had not just been Webb's colleague or his competitor or a stranger who happened to work in the same field. She had been his protégé, his student, someone he had trained and guided and believed in, someone he had been proud of, someone he had invested his time and knowledge in, with the expectation that she would carry forward his commitment to protecting the environment, to using science in service of truth rather than profit. And she had betrayed him in the most profound way possible, had taken everything he had taught her about environmental analysis and testing protocols and scientific integrity, and had weaponized that knowledge, had used her expertise to create a sophisticated system of fraud that was all the more effective because she understood exactly how environmental protection was supposed to work and therefore knew precisely how to circumvent it. The photograph represented a relationship that had existed before the corruption, before Apex, before the choice that had transformed a promising young scientist into the architect of a criminal conspiracy. Sarah tried to imagine what it must have been like for Webb when he realized what his brightest student had become, when his investigation into Apex had led him to discover that the woman signing off on falsified reports, the woman orchestrating bribes to state officials, the woman ultimately responsible for poisoning thousands of people, was someone he had once mentored, someone he had been proud of, someone who had learned how to commit these crimes in part because he had taught her so well. The betrayal was not just professional, but deeply, intimately personal, a violation of trust that went to the very heart of Webb's identity as a teacher and a scientist. It explained the tone of his final journal entries, the sense of profound disillusionment that had colored his words, the way he had written about the conspiracy not just as a crime but as a kind of spiritual corruption, a transformation of something good into something monstrous. Webb had not just been fighting a corporation, he had been fighting to stop someone he had once cared about, someone he had helped create, and that fight had killed him. The message came through Father Thomas the following afternoon, delivered by a courier service that specialized in discreet communications. A simple cream-colored envelope containing a single card embossed with Victoria Crane's name and a handwritten note in elegant script, Mrs. Winters, I believe we have mutual interests that would benefit from a private conversation. I can offer solutions to your current difficulties. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Apex Tower, Suite 1200. Come alone. You have my word you will be safe. Margaret had argued vehemently against going, had pointed out that it was obviously a trap, that Crane wanted to assess Sarah personally, to determine what kind of threat she posed, to gather intelligence that could be used against her. But Sarah had made the decision with a clarity that surprised even herself. She needed to look Victoria Crane in the eyes, needed to understand the woman who had been Webb's student, who had orchestrated his death, who now held the power to destroy or save them. She left Emma in Father Thomas's care, with Bear as the child's protector, and took a city bus downtown to the gleaming glass tower that housed Apex Environmental Services corporate headquarters. Riding the elevator to the 12th floor, where a receptionist who had clearly been expecting her led her through corridors of polished marble and expensive art, to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a prescient example tinted despecting panoramic view of Billings and the snow-covered mountains beyond. Victoria Crane stood as Sarah entered, and in person she was even more formidable than she had appeared in the press conference, a woman who radiated controlled power, who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning, who wore her authority like the perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sarah had spent on rent in a year. She gestured to a leather chair across from her massive desk, offered coffee or water with the practiced courtesy of a hostess who knew that civility could be a weapon, and Sarah declined both, sitting stiffly, refusing to be comfortable in this place. Crane settled into her own chair, steepled her fingers, and studied Sarah with eyes that were intelligent, calculating, and completely devoid of the warmth she had displayed for the cameras. Mrs. Winters, she began, her voice pleasant but with an edge of steel beneath the smoothness. I want to begin by acknowledging that you have found yourself in an impossible situation through no fault of your own. You did the right thing by reporting irregularities you observed at Apex, and it's unfortunate that corporate protocols at the time did not properly address your concerns. That was a failure of management, and I take responsibility for it. The words were carefully chosen, an apology that admitted nothing actionable, that reframed Sarah's firing as a misunderstanding rather than retaliation, and Sarah remained silent, waiting for the real conversation to begin. Crane continued, I also want to acknowledge that Dr. Webb's death was a tragedy. He was my mentor once, many years ago, and I grieve his loss." She paused, and Sarah saw something flicker in her eyes, something that might have been genuine regret or might have been perfectly performed emotion. But dwelling on tragedies does not help anyone, and I am a practical woman who believes in finding solutions that benefit everyone involved. So let me be direct with you. I know you have access to materials that Dr. Webb compiled, materials that present a very negative and, I would argue, fundamentally distorted picture of Apex's operations. Those materials, if they were to become public, would cause tremendous harm not just to this company, but to hundreds of employees who rely on Apex for their livelihoods, to communities that depend on the economic activity we generate, to the entire environmental services industry in Montana. She opened a desk drawer and withdrew a folder, sliding it across the polished surface toward Sarah. "I am prepared to offer you $500,000 in cash, delivered to any account you specify, or in any form you prefer. In addition, my company maintains relationships with several firms that specialize in creating new identities, legal name changes, background documentation, everything you would need to start completely fresh in any city you choose, anywhere in the country. And finally, I personally guarantee that your daughter Emma will have a full scholarship to any college or university she wishes to attend, with all expenses covered, including housing, books, medical care, everything. She will want for nothing." The offer hung in the air between them, massive and tempting, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. And Crane let the silence stretch, let Sarah absorb the implications. Let her imagine what that money could mean, the apartment they could rent, the food they could buy, the normal life they could reclaim. Then Crane leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, almost kind. "Mrs. Winters, Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I want you to understand something important. You are not an activist or a crusader or a political person. You are a mother who loves her daughter and wants to protect her. That is not a weakness. That is the most powerful and honorable thing a person can be. The materials you have do not belong to you. They belong to Dr. Webb, and he is gone. You did not ask for this burden, and you have no obligation to carry it. Your only obligation is to Emma, to give her the childhood she deserves, the future she deserves. I am offering you the means to do that. All you need to do is destroy what Webb left behind, walk away, and choose your daughter over a dead man's crusade." Crane sat back, her expression one of patient certainty, a woman who knew she had just offered something irresistible, who knew that poverty and desperation were more effective weapons than threats, who knew that every mother had a price and had just named Sarah's. Sarah returned to the church in the late afternoon, her mind a chaotic storm of conflicting thoughts. Victoria Crane's offer echoing in her head with the seductive whisper of a devil who knew exactly which temptations would cut deepest. $500,000, a new identity, a future for Emma that included college and security and everything Sarah had lost when she made the mistake of being honest, everything she had watched slip away during those terrible weeks on the frozen streets. She descended into the church basement where Emma was helping Margaret organize files, where Bear lay sleeping in a patch of sunlight from the high window, where Father Thomas was reading quietly in the corner. And the normalcy of the scene, the peaceful industry of good people doing good work, made Crane's offer feel even more real, even more possible. Margaret looked up as Sarah entered, her sharp eyes immediately reading the conflict written across Sarah's face, and she set down the file she had been examining and asked quietly, "What did she offer you?" Sarah told them everything, her voice flat and exhausted, repeating Crane's words about being a mother rather than a crusader, about choosing Emma over a dead man's crusade. And as she spoke, she watched Emma's face, saw her daughter's expression shift from curiosity to understanding, to something that looked almost like fear. When Sarah finished, Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the table where Webb's contamination maps were spread out. The large topographical charts with their red circles marking zones of poison, and she picked up a specific map, the one showing Billings and the northeast quadrant where Sarah and Emma had lived. "Before you make any decision," Margaret said, her voice gentle but unyielding, "I need to show you something I found while you were gone. I spent the afternoon cross-referencing Webb's contamination data with public health records from the Montana Department of Health, specifically looking at the census tract that includes Meadowview Gardens and the surrounding neighborhoods." She spread the map on the table and pointed to a series of small handwritten notations she had added in pencil. names and dates that Sarah did not immediately recognize. In the past 10 years, 7 children under the age of 15 who lived within a 1-mile radius of your apartment complex died of rare cancers. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, neuroblastoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, cancers that typically occur in 1 or 2 children per 100,000 population, but in this neighborhood with a population of maybe 3,000 people, there were 7 cases, all fatal. The statistical probability of that occurring randomly is essentially 0. It's a cancer cluster, Sarah, directly attributable to the heavy metal contamination in the groundwater that Apex certified as safe. Margaret pointed to each notation in turn, reading the names that were written there. Names that meant nothing to Sarah but that represented children who had lived and played and attended school in the same poisoned neighborhood where Emma had grown up. Children whose parents had trusted that the water coming from their taps was safe because the government had told them it was safe, because Apex Environmental Services had filed reports saying it was safe. Michael Torres, age 7, died 2019. Ashley Chen, age 12, died 2020. Roberto Martinez, age 9, died 2021. Kimberly Jackson, age 6, died 2022. David Nguyen, age 11, died 2023. Sarah White, age 8, died 2024. Marcus Johnson, age 14, died 2025. Margaret's voice broke slightly on that last name, on the cruel coincidence that one of the dead children shared Webb's first name, as if the universe was making a point about the cost of Apex's crimes. Then, she looked directly at Sarah, her eyes filled with a terrible compassion. Emma was sick all last year with the same symptoms these children had in their early stages, the respiratory problems, the fatigue, the nosebleeds. She was nearly the 8th, Sarah. The only reason she is not on this list is because you lost your apartment, because being homeless and freezing on the streets actually saved her life by removing her from the source of contamination. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs, and she looked at Emma, at her daughter who sat perfectly still, processing this information, understanding that she had been dying slowly in a place that was supposed to be home, that 7 other children had not been as lucky as she was, that her survival was an accident of timing and eviction. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, felt the seductive whisper of Crane's offer dissolve like morning frost under a harsh sun, felt a clarity of purpose that was almost painful in its intensity. She pulled out Webb's burner phone, the phone with the single contact saved, and she dialed Agent Chen's number, and when the FBI agent answered, Sarah spoke with a voice that was steady and certain and irrevocable. "Agent Chen, this is Sarah Winters. Victoria Crane offered me $500,000 and a new identity to destroy the evidence and disappear. I'm calling to tell you that I refused, that I am committed to testifying, that I will do whatever it takes to make sure Apex Environmental Services and everyone involved in this conspiracy faces justice. Dr. Webb died for this truth, and 7 children in my neighborhood died because of Apex's lies, and I will not let their deaths be meaningless. Tell me what you need from me, and I will do it." Sarah had made her decision, had committed to the path of testimony and justice, and she had gone to sleep that night in the church basement with Emma curled beside her and Bear stretched out on the floor nearby, feeling for the first time in months a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival, a conviction that what they were doing mattered more than their own safety. It was perhaps 2 in the morning when Bear's frantic barking tore her from sleep. Not the low warning growl he used for distant threats, but a full-throated alarm that spoke of immediate, lethal danger. And Sarah was on her feet before she was fully awake, her body moving on instinct, her eyes trying to adjust to the darkness of the basement. Bear was at the small window that looked out at street level, his barking continuous and desperate, and when Sarah reached him and looked out, she saw a sight that turned her blood to ice. 2 figures in dark clothing moving swiftly along the side of the church, and in their hands were bottles with flaming rags stuffed into their necks, the orange fire bright against the darkness, unmistakable in their purpose. She screamed for Emma, for Margaret, and the first Molotov cocktail shattered against the church's wooden siding directly above the basement window. The sound of breaking glass followed immediately by a whoosh of igniting gasoline, and suddenly the world outside the window was a wall of orange flame that spread with terrifying speed across the old dry wood. Sarah grabbed Emma, who was awake now and screaming, and Bear continued his frantic barking as the second Molotov cocktail hit somewhere else, then a third. and the church that had been their sanctuary was being systematically set ablaze by people who wanted to destroy the evidence and everyone who knew about it. Margaret was already moving toward the stairs, and Father Thomas appeared at the top of the stairwell, his face illuminated by the growing firelight, shouting for them to get out, to evacuate immediately, and Sarah's mind raced through their impossible options. The evidence, Webb's van with all its files and computers and proof, was in the church garage, accessible through a door at the far end of the basement. And if they ran up the stairs and out the front of the church, if they saved themselves and left the van behind, everything Webb had died for would burn, everything they had suffered for would be lost, and Apex would win, would bury the truth under ashes and rubble, and the official story of a tragic accidental fire. Sarah made a split-second decision that was either courage or madness. She thrust Emma toward Margaret, screaming, "Get her out! Get everyone out!" And then she turned and ran toward the garage door, Bear immediately at her heels, understanding that his human was not fleeing, but advancing toward danger. The basement was filling with smoke now, the fire above them consuming the church's wooden frame with a roar that sounded like a living beast. And Sarah could feel the heat pressing down from above as she reached the garage door, yanked it open, and saw Webb's white van sitting exactly where they had hidden it days ago. The garage had its own exit, a roll-up door that opened onto the side street, and Sarah prayed it was not locked, that Father Thomas had not secured it, as she climbed into the van's driver's seat, Bear leaping in beside her, and turned the key that was still in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Sarah threw the transmission into drive, not bothering to check mirrors or clearance, and simply aimed the van at the roll-up door and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The van hit the garage door with a tremendous crash, the thin aluminum crumpling and tearing, and suddenly they were outside, cold air and smoke and flames all around them, debris from the burning church beginning to rain down. Sarah drove blindly through the smoke, her hands locked on the wheel, Bear bracing himself against the dashboard, and she heard sirens in the distance, fire trucks responding to the blaze. But she could not stop, could not risk being trapped by emergency responders, who might include compromised officials, who might hand them over to the very people who had set this fire. She drove through residential streets, her heart hammering, checking the rearview mirror compulsively to see if they were being followed, and only when she was several miles away, when she was certain no vehicles were pursuing them, did she pull into the empty parking lot of a closed shopping center and allow herself to breathe, to take stock of what had just happened. The church was gone, their sanctuary destroyed, Father Thomas and Margaret and Emma scattered, and she and Bear were alone in the van with the evidence that had already cost so many lives. Hunted now by enemies who had abandoned all pretense of subtlety, who had escalated from surveillance to attempted murder, who would stop at nothing to silence them. Sarah called Agent Chen from the parking lot, her voice shaking as she explained about the fire, about the Molotov cocktails, about barely escaping with the van and the evidence, and she could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, the muttered curse that spoke of an investigation that had just become exponentially more dangerous and more urgent. Chen's response was immediate and decisive, her voice taking on the clipped tone of command that came from years of dealing with criminal organizations willing to kill witnesses. "Listen to me very carefully, Mrs. Winters. Do not go back to that church. Do not try to contact Father Thomas or Margaret directly. I am arranging protective custody right now. I'm going to give you an address, a location on the outskirts of Billings. Drive there immediately, park the van in the garage, and wait. Federal marshals will meet you within the hour. Do you understand?" Sarah understood, and she drove through the pre-dawn darkness following Chen's directions to an address that turned out to be a nondescript ranch house on a rural road 20 miles outside the city. Surrounded by empty fields and distant farms, the kind of place where strangers would be noticed immediately and where approach routes could be monitored from a distance. She pulled the van into the detached garage as instructed, killed the engine, and waited with Bear pressed against her side, both of them exhausted and traumatized, until headlights appeared and 2 black SUVs pulled into the driveway. The federal marshals were professional and efficient, 4 agents who checked her identification, verified her identity with a call to Chen, and then conducted a thorough security sweep of the property before allowing her inside the house, where she found Emma already waiting, brought there separately by other marshals who had evacuated her from the church. The reunion was tearful and desperate, Sarah holding her daughter close, checking her for injuries, whispering reassurances that they were safe now, that the government was protecting them, and Emma clung to her mother with a fierceness that spoke of how close they had come to losing each other. The safe house was modest but comfortable, a 3-bedroom home with furniture that looked like it came from a government catalog, bland and functional but clean and warm. For the first time in months, Emma slept in a real bed with clean sheets and a thick comforter, rather than on the floor of a shelter or the cot in a van or the frozen ground of an alley. The Marshalls brought food, real food from a grocery store rather than soup kitchen rations, and they fed Bear properly, giving the dog kibble and fresh water, and even some canned food that made his tail wag with enthusiasm. Sarah stood in the kitchen that first morning, watching dawn break over the snow-covered fields through a window fitted with bulletproof glass, and she felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. They were safe for now, protected by federal agents whose job was to keep witnesses alive long enough to testify, but she was not naive enough to believe this was over. Agent Chen had been clear during her follow-up calls that the evidence Sarah and Margaret had compiled was being reviewed by FBI analysts, that the case against Apex and Victoria Crane was being built with meticulous care, that indictments were being prepared, but she had also warned that Crane's legal team, staffed by some of the most expensive and aggressive defense attorneys in the country, was already mounting a counteroffensive, filing motions to suppress evidence, challenging the legality of Webb's investigation, claiming that Sarah was a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta rather than a legitimate whistleblower. The fight was far from over, and the temporary sanctuary of the safe house was just a pause before the real battle began. The safe house had provided 6 days of relative peace, 6 days during which Emma began to regain some of her lost childhood innocence, playing board games with the Marshalls and sleeping without nightmares. 6 days during which Sarah worked with Agent Chen remotely to prepare her testimony, reviewing documents and timelines, and practicing her responses to the hostile cross-examination that would inevitably come. 6 days during which Bear had relaxed into the rhythm of regular meals and warm floors, and the absence of immediate threat. But Victoria Crane was not a woman who accepted defeat, and her desperation had made her reckless in ways that would ultimately seal her fate. On the morning of the 7th day, as the first pale light of dawn was just beginning to touch the snow-covered fields surrounding the safe house, Bear woke from sleep with a suddenness that spoke of alarm, his head snapping up, his ears forward, his body going rigid in that familiar stance that meant danger was approaching. Sarah, who had learned to sleep lightly during their months of survival, was awake instantly, and she saw Bear move to the window of the bedroom she shared with Emma, saw him staring out at the pre-dawn darkness with an intensity that made her heart begin to race. She moved to join him, peering out carefully, and in the dim light she saw shapes moving across the field, 3 dark figures approaching the house in a tactical formation, carrying what were unmistakably rifles. Sarah's scream of warning brought the federal marshals running, but the attackers had timed their assault for the shift change, for the moment of maximum vulnerability, when exhausted agents were being replaced by fresh ones, and they breached the perimeter with professional speed, one of them placing a shaped charge on the back door while the others covered the approach. The explosion was deafening, blowing the door off its hinges, and suddenly armed men in tactical gear were pouring into the house, and Bear did not hesitate, did not wait for commands or permission. He launched himself at the first man through the door, 80 pounds of furious protective instinct, his jaws closing on the operative's forearm, bringing him down in a tangle of limbs and screaming, buying precious seconds for Sarah to grab Emma and pull her behind the bed, for the marshals to take defensive positions and return fire. The firefight that erupted was brief but intense, the confined space of the house echoing with gunshots and shouted commands, and Bear, having disabled the first attacker, turned his attention to a second man who was advancing toward the bedroom where Emma cowered, and the dog threw himself at this new threat with the same fearless determination. The operative, panicked by the snarling animal coming at him, fired his weapon, and Bear yelped in pain as a bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. But even wounded, the dog did not retreat, did not give ground, continuing to place himself between the armed men and Emma until federal agents finally subdued all 3 attackers, zip-tying their hands and securing the scene. The fight was over in less than 3 minutes, and when the chaos finally settled, Sarah found Bear lying on the floor near Emma's bed, blood matting his silver and white fur. His breathing labored, but his eyes still alert, still watching for threats. The marshals called for emergency veterinary care, and while they waited, one of the captured operatives, A man in his 30s who was bleeding from a gunshot wound to his leg and clearly terrified by the realization that he was facing life in prison for attempting to murder federal witnesses, began to talk. His name was Derek Mills, and he had been hired through a private military contractor, and he told Agent Chen, who arrived within an hour, everything she needed to know about how Victoria Crane had personally ordered the attack, how she had obtained the safe house location through a corrupt deputy marshal who was now also under arrest, how she had promised them $200,000 to eliminate Sarah and destroy the evidence. And his testimony, recorded and sworn, provided the final piece of evidence that would link Crane directly to conspiracy to commit murder. The trial took place in the federal courthouse in Billings 6 months after the attack on the safe house, 6 months during which Bear had recovered fully from his gunshot wound and had been awarded a special commendation from the FBI for his role in protecting a federal witness. 6 months during which Agent Chen and her team had built an airtight case using Webb's meticulous documentation, Sarah's insider knowledge of Apex's operations, and Derek Mills's testimony about the conspiracy to commit murder. The proceedings lasted only 3 weeks, far shorter than the defense had hoped, because the evidence was so overwhelming, so comprehensive, so damning that no amount of expensive legal maneuvering could obscure the truth of what Apex Environmental Services had done. Sarah sat in the witness box for 2 full days, her voice steady as she explained how she had discovered the initial fraud, how she had been fired and blacklisted for reporting it, how she had found Webb's van and realized the scope of the conspiracy, and the jury, composed of 12 ordinary Montana citizens who understood what it meant when someone poisoned your water and lied about it, listened with expressions that grew progressively more horrified and angry. Margaret testified as an expert witness, walking the jury through the contamination maps, the falsified reports, the payment records that showed millions of dollars flowing from Apex to corrupt officials, making the complex web of criminality comprehensible to laypeople. Derek Mills, the captured operative, testified with the defeated air of a man who had realized too late that he had sold his soul to the wrong people, describing in detail how Victoria Crane had personally met with him, had shown him photographs of Sarah and Emma, had told him that they needed to be eliminated before they could testify, had promised him enough money to disappear to South America and live comfortably for the rest of his life. When Crane herself took the stand, her polished corporate demeanor finally cracked under the relentless questioning of the federal prosecutor, her carefully constructed narrative falling apart as she was confronted with her own emails, her own financial records, her own words captured in recordings that Webb had made during one of their final confrontations. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for Victoria Crane and 14 other Apex executives, convictions for environmental crimes, conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. The state inspectors and county officials who had accepted bribes were tried separately, and most accepted plea deals rather than face juries who had already seen the evidence of their corruption displayed in the Apex trial. The sentencing hearing was held on a cold January morning, and the federal judge, a woman in her 70s who had spent 40 years on the bench and had seen every kind of human depravity, delivered her sentence with a voice that shook with controlled fury. Victoria Crane received 35 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, and the other executives received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, ensuring that none of them would ever work in environmental services again, that their careers and reputations were destroyed as thoroughly as they had destroyed the lives of their victims. But the judge's final order was perhaps the most significant. She mandated that Apex Environmental Services, which would be dissolved and its assets liquidated, must fund a comprehensive environmental cleanup of every site Webb had documented, a process that would take years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and she established a victim compensation fund exceeding $200 million to be distributed to the families of those who had died from contamination-related illnesses and to the communities whose water and soil had been poisoned, ensuring that at least some measure of justice would reach the people who had suffered most from Apex's crimes. 6 months after Victoria Crane's sentencing, on a bright Saturday morning in late spring when the Montana snow had finally melted and the first green shoots of new grass were pushing through the thawed earth, Sarah stood on the front porch of a modest 2-bedroom house on a quiet street on the outskirts of Billings, a cup of coffee warm in her hands, watching Emma play in the yard with Bear. The house was small, nothing extravagant, but it was theirs, purchased with Sarah's portion of the federal whistleblower reward that had been substantial enough to provide a down payment, an emergency fund, and the promise of stability that had seemed impossible during those frozen weeks when they had huddled in alleys waiting to die. Emma, who had turned 13 2 weeks ago with a proper birthday party attended by new friends from her school, looked healthy in a way that still made Sarah's heart ache with gratitude. Her cheeks full of color, her eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of a child who was no longer carrying the weight of adult fears, her laughter ringing out as she threw a tennis ball, and Bear, fully recovered from his gunshot wound and sporting only a small scar hidden beneath his thick fur, bounded after it with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog. Sarah had a new job now, working as a field investigator for the EPA's Enforcement Division, using her knowledge of how environmental fraud was committed to help prevent it. And while the irony of working for a government agency after being betrayed by government corruption was not lost on her, she found purpose in the work, in the knowledge that she was helping to ensure that other families would not suffer as hers had. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway drew her attention, and she smiled as she recognized Father Thomas's old sedan, the priest emerging with his characteristic gentle energy, his face lighting up as Emma ran to greet him. His church had been rebuilt with insurance money and donations from the community, and in a gesture that had moved Sarah to tears, the parish had voted to rename it the Marcus Webb Community Center, dedicating the new building to the memory of the scientist who had given his life in pursuit of truth. And Father Thomas had invited Sarah and Emma to the dedication ceremony, where they had unveiled a plaque honoring Webb's sacrifice. As Father Thomas joined her on the porch and they watched Emma and Bear play, as they talked about ordinary things like Emma's grades and Bear's latest antics and the garden Sarah was planning to plant, she felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten what it was: peace. They had lost everything: their apartment and their security and their naive belief that the system protected the innocent. But they had found something infinitely more valuable in the losing. They had found the strength to stand for what was right, even when it cost them everything. The courage to speak truth even when powerful people wanted them silenced. The understanding that justice was not something that happened automatically, but something that required ordinary people to be willing to fight for it. And they had found each other. Had found that the bond between a mother and daughter, and a loyal dog, could survive poverty and violence and betrayal, and emerge stronger for having been tested. Sarah looked at Emma's smiling face, at Bear's wagging tail, at the modest house that represented not wealth but safety, and she understood with perfect clarity that they were finally, truly home.